So I am Associate Professor Claire Hooker from Sydney Health Ethics in the Sydney School of Public Health, having an extended conversation after a fabulous workshop with Professor Sarah Flicker from York University in Toronto, Canada. And we have been talking as a continuation from yesterday's workshop about co-design. And people sent in a whole pile of questions that we didn't get to answer. So we're going to have a go at answering some of them now. And the first one, Sarah, is a great question. And it was, how can PhD students who have no or limited funding do co-design?
Oh, that is such a good question. And it's a question I feel like we all wrestle with as supervisors. So I would say you actually don't need tons of money, but I think you do need some. I think it's really important to be able to provide at the bare minimum an honoraria and some snacks for folks who come out to things. I know in my faculty and department, there are small pots of money that grad students can access, like little, $500, $1,000. And I think that's enough to get going, right? It's enough to have a few meetings. It's enough to get started. It's enough to start the conversations. And as you develop the relationships with communities and decide, like, this is what I'm going to do, then you would need to build a little bit more time to go look for other kinds of funding. And I said yesterday, and I'll repeat here, I wouldn't underestimate what you can do with $5,000. Like, that's actually enough money to get a little project off the ground. So I know it's a bit of a disappointing answer, like, what can I do with no money? But what I would say, what you can start to do for sure is build the relationships, hang out with people, meet people for coffee, go to events being sponsored by the community, like show up and be present and build in the lead time. And of course, a very pat answer, like, talk to your supervisor and see, can you apply for things together? I do that with a lot of my PhD students. We apply for grants together, and that gets to fund their dissertation.
And I suppose another possible avenue, not appropriate for all projects, when I'm just reflecting on a student of mine, is occasionally you can think of a project where the outcome that you offer people is so much desired that it becomes the form of compensation that's appropriate for your collaborators. In that case, what I was thinking of was a student who was examining stories of people who have invisible disabilities. And what she did was use her own labor to build a beautiful website where some of these stories could be displayed. And because the participants wanted to make these stories more publicly visible, then having the story out in the public where it could do advocacy work was a useful outcome for them.
Yeah, that's a great example. And another example I have is I had a student who was a filmmaker who made very similarly, like, created the film alongside folks, and they were really excited about the film being out in the world. So I think there's certainly possibilities for being creative, but it's a funny thing for students who want to do co-design. I always tell them, you have to be planning out a year ahead. Like, you really have to be thinking, because ethics often takes longer. You finding funding takes a little while. So really planning pretty far out is key for finishing on time anyway.
100%. Now we have a couple of questions that came up in the workshop yesterday, but that we might be able to address here again with slightly different wording, and they come up again and again and again. So I'll say all three of them now, but then we can take them one at a time. So the first one is, how do you write a proposal, whether it's for funding or for a project, where that centers co-design, where the expectation of the people who will approve that project is that there will be outcomes, but you can't specify the outcomes because the whole point is that they'll be created collaboratively through a co-design process whose outcomes are uncertain. How do you produce that and navigate your way through? The second one has to do with how you navigate when something occurs in your project where there is a real tension between the institutional demands that you face and what your co-designers want or your community wants. And actually, I think that's it. I think those are, oh no, and the third one was, if you don't know where to start, how do you figure out who is the community? Who do you get in touch with first? How do you cold call someone? I think those are three really familiar questions.
Great questions. All three are super great. Okay, so let's start with three, because in some ways it's the, I don't know, the easiest, but it seems like the easiest one to enter into as a discussion. So how do you cold call? Well, I don't recommend cold calling as a general practice. I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's really a very uphill battle to cold call someone and say, hey, do you want to do a research project with me? Especially in communities where like research has a pretty bad rap. So I think a much more, an approach that might yield better results, for instance, would be to, well, a couple, to get introduced by someone that you both trust. That's always a really nice way to meet someone. To start showing up to community events. I feel like that is a really respectful one. So it gets you a lay of the land. It gets you a sense of who's in the community, who are the political actors, where are they positioned, who gets heard, who doesn't get heard, and going to like a kind of a few events or activities or protests, things happening in the community will position you far better to make those contacts in a warm and genuine way, before sort of saying, hey, like, let's partner. So I think yesterday I used the analogy a little bit of like marriage and dating. Like it's more like, you know, hanging out and picking up, rather than sort of being like out of the blue, hey, will you do this with me?
I am totally going to start thinking of early explorations as being in a situationship.
Yes, that's my new Australian term. Exactly. It's a total situationship. Yeah. And I love to, when you were explaining to me about situationships and teen dating, how it's really important to be explicit about where you're at and go to the next level together with consent and thinking about it and having, I think that analogy and those conversations are really important for thinking about partnerships in research. Because again, as I sort of said yesterday, like they can be quite long-term, but they, like all relationships, they require nurturing, they require attention, love, care. So I think that's great. And then that sort of leads me to the next question, like what happens when there's conflict? And I talked about that also a little bit yesterday as well, which is, I think conflict is a sign of a healthy relationship, like respectful conflict, obviously not abusive conflict or situations where people feel, you know, unsafe or disrespected. But I do think that being able to talk through real differences of opinion makes for a better team and a better project, and often leads you to everyone to new places, right? If we can both put our cards on the table, and I used that analogy yesterday, but if we can both put our concerns and where they're coming from and have that be an open and honest conversation, it's a lot easier to navigate through it, because then we can really understand and problem solve together. I think a lot of the time what happens is people don't want to talk about conflict. They don't want to tell you what's actually going on, and resentments build. Mm-hmm. And once resentments build and people sort of get grounded in their resentment rather than working through a solution. So I think there's so many examples of this, and this happens all the time. And I think a lot of the time people sort of fall back on stereotypes. Oh, the academic only cares about publishing, which probably couldn't be farther from the truth for most people who are interested in co-design, because it's not easier, you know, like they're doing it because they deeply care, but they also have pressures, right? And they also have accountabilities. And so I think that would be, I know it sounds like such a basic answer, but like, I really do think that being able to have the conversations and the hard conversations and sitting through them together makes the team stronger.
And in fact, I tend to approach my working life through the application of guiding principles in that way. And so I find that that's actually really what you're saying is absolutely resonating, because it's the principle that I tend to apply when in the thick of it, I'm not sure what the right direction is. And it's when I'm not sure what the right direction is, but I have that sense that maybe I'm being guided by my own anxiety or my own defensiveness or an inability to get past annoyance to find a true understanding of somebody else's perspective, then that's when I reach for the principles to be the guide for what the next step should be. And one of those principles is being clear and explicit about what my needs are and why I might be feeling some concern about something, so that it's tangible and specified and not everything. It's actually often a lot smaller than I think it is when I'm explicit about it. There are actually a couple more questions that came in around particular kinds of potential conflicts, so we might do them while we're on the topic. And I'll read them both out. One says, what do I do when my own knowledge or expertise is contradicted by lived experience? For some reason, this table has weird formatting, which means I can't quite see the, here we go. This person has said, sometimes lived experience can be quite subjective and narrow. I feel condescending even raising this question, but lived experience can be very varied, and sometimes people can be seeing things through a very partial perspective in the co-design process that is contradicted by my own expertise. I actually have a great example of this. The other question is, besides thinking about human research ethics applications, so putting that aside, how do you navigate co-design discussion groups where there's potential for distress, such as handling, subjects and topics where people might be experiencing distress, and that's part of the research area? The example given was actually about breastfeeding or feeding babies, where there could be quite a lot of feelings around whether you've used formula or not used formula, but we can easily imagine many other situations. With respect to that first one about contradictory experiences, I read a paper a little while ago that reported on a qualitative study with men who were trying to apply for access to children after a separation. And the paper reported on these men's experiences of feeling frustrated and like people didn't understand their expertise as fathers, and that they were their role in the domestic work had been very undervalued. And I was reading this paper and thinking, I have seen personally lots of men who say that while being absolute assholes, if I may say so, at home, right? And I know that a huge pile of women leave after a long time of living with a partner whose actions actually deny or gaslight the lived reality of the other side of that coin. And the paper did not discuss that gap. It just presented these experiences like they were just the truth. And so that might be a beautiful example for thinking about what happens if I'm working in an area and my participant is talking about some aspect of lived experience, but I have my own expertise that suggests that there may be more to it than where they are located.
Oh, it's such a good question, and it's such a beautiful and complicated question. And I have lots of examples for sure, where, we have different perspectives on the same issue, right? But I think that's the whole reason we're bringing people together, right? If we all had the same perspective on the issue, then there would be no good reason to get together, because we already know what everybody's going to say. And I think it's kind of talking through the differences that is going to get us all to another place. One of the things I love about co-design, and particularly working with groups, is that I don't think it's always on me to challenge folks. It might be on me to raise the question. It might be on me as a facilitator who's brought people together to sort of say, does this resonate with other people? What do you think of that perspective? Or even ask the questions like, is there another way to think about that? How does that make other people feel, right? So to bring in, if you do have a co-design process put together with enough people with diverse perspectives, then I don't think it should ever be like my expertise versus your expertise, because that doesn't get us anywhere. It should be, how do we understand each other's position? And why did we come to the positions that we're in? And is there any possibility for collective movement in different directions? And I have a really great example of this. I do a lot of work with teenagers. I do a lot of work around sex and drugs. So lots of kind of taboo topics, lots of potential for very difficult and distressing. And I was working with a group of Indigenous young men who were talking about the impacts of colonization in their lives. And they wrote some beautiful music. They were writing hip hop songs. But in the music that they wrote, they were using incredibly sexist language. They were calling women bitches. They were, and you know, there was a lot of sexism. So what was so interesting to me is in this moment where they were sort of fighting back against colonialism, they were also like reproducing these very like hegemonic, discriminatory, kind of awful gendered language that that they didn't see the parallels. And so rather than sort of say like, hey, that's super sexist, which I don't think would have gotten me anywhere, I said, you know, I'm listening to these lyrics and I'm really curious, like, how do you guys think about women? Like, what is happening that, you know, like, tell me about this decision to use this language, because it makes me a bit uncomfortable. Like, so can we talk about it? And it was through the kinds of conversations where we got to another place together, rather than me sort of saying like, I'm a professor who teaches women's studies, let me tell you about how problematic this is. It was more of a like, I really want to understand why you chose to talk about the women in your community in this way, and how does that relate to like the themes of what we're talking about. And then there were girls in the group who like totally stepped in. Like I just had to open up the question, but it was through like peers that kind of took it up. So I think like kind of using some of those Freirian dialogues that I just like love Freire's work around this. But thinking about like, how do we do critical consciousness raising that starts from the knowledge of what's in the room, can help us with some of that. Now, I think the other question around distress is also interesting, because I think there is a range of what we can think about as distress, ranging from like feeling discomfort to actually feeling distress. And so I do a lot of work around sexual violence. A lot of time when we talk about sex, people disclose violence. Sometimes it's the first time they're disclosing assault or rape. And I would characterize that as a situation of deep distress. And I think in those situations, like having a protocol before you ever walk in the door, what are we going to do if, who are the community contacts, who are the resources, how do we have conversations about our fiduciary duties and like duty to report to police or to social workers, and how do we want to handle all of that, and all the complications around that are really important before you kind of ever walk in.
Just since you're there, do you want to just say how in general you do handle that particular situation? Because I bet there will be people who would like to hear you say that.
Yeah. So before I ever go in, I always have someone from the community that is a trusted ally of young people who is on hand to call if necessary. So if I'm in a school, that might be a teacher or a guidance counselor. If I'm on a rural and remote community, it might be someone at the health center. It might be a trained psychologist that we have on the project. So there will always be someone I have identified ahead of time And then, of course, when I'm talking to youth, I always like usually you can see a disclosure coming kind of a mile away, and I always remind people, I want you to tell me your stories. I really feel like you can, but if you tell me X, Y, and Z, and it looks like you might be about to be telling me that, here's what I have to do next. So let's think carefully about the next words you say, so that I can make sure, and you can make sure that this is what you want to happen next. And then obviously I might pause an interview, turn off a recorder, make sure that the youth has the supports they need. I would never like leave them alone. I'd be like, is there a friend we can call, a trusted adult we can call? Is there someone we can, to make sure you're okay in this moment? And when necessary, sometimes we do have to call the authorities and intervene. But I think all those safety steps have to kind of be in place. So I think there's examples of this is real distress, or we have a real duty to intervene, and that's when someone's suicidal or threatening self-harm of self or harm of others, right? That's one kind of constellation of things that can happen, of course, in any research project. And I don't think that's unique to co-design. I think that's sort of just people who work in communities face these issues. The example that was raised about people feeling distressed or uncomfortable about talking about breastfeeding or formula feeding, while I can fully appreciate that that might bring up lots of feelings and big feelings, it would really depend on the level of distress that they are in. I think tears are part of human emotion, and people cry, and it's okay for people to cry, and it's okay for people to feel sad, and it's okay for people to feel mad too. Like the full range of human emotions is welcome. But what we don't want to do is leave someone in a state of distress as we close off a group, right? So I think there is always this fine balance of allowing people to have that huge range of emotions that is totally normal, and validating those feelings wherever they are, wherever they come from. And then also making an assessment like, are you actually okay to move on to the next part of your day? And what would it take to help you move on? And if you're really in distress, always having kind of professional support services. And I'm always really clear with my students, you are not trained social workers, you are not trained psychologists. Your job is not to do counseling. And our job as researchers is not to do counseling, but it is to make sure that there's a warm referral to counseling services if we feel that is appropriate afterward. And then making that judgment call of like, is this person having a feeling, or is this person in distress? And how do we make sure that they're well enough to continue on with their day?
Do you have self-care practices that you bring in for yourself in the infrequent but occasional circumstances where you're in the quite demanding true distress kind of contexts, the way psychologists have supervision and so on?
I think this is really important, especially in situations where we're training peer interviewers, right? So I had this lovely project recently, and young women were interviewing other young women, and they were interviewing their peers, and they weren't necessarily highly skilled or trained in psychology or social worker. And when they started hearing stories of sexual violence or stories of discrimination that were really heavy, hard stories to hear and to hold, not only did we do work around how do we find the participants the supports they need, but we brought in a psychologist on our research team just to support the peer researchers so that they could have some debriefing and develop some skills around like, how do you hear and hold those stories, and how do you take care of yourself afterward, and how do we make sure we're okay? Because hearing stories of trauma over and over and over again, the trauma, we hold them, they become embodied. So I think making sure that we have outlets and people on our team that we can talk to and help us let them go, like release that stress, is really, really important. So those are some examples. And what's really funny is someone pointed this out to me a couple of years ago, and I didn't even see the pattern, but I almost always hire social workers as research coordinators. And I don't do it on purpose. Like, it's not like I go looking necessarily for someone with an MSW, but it seems like when I'm interviewing folks for who's going to be my research coordinator, they seem to be the people who have all of those skills. Like, they have the clinical skills, they know how to take care of people, they know how to do the referrals and all the brilliant like project management skills. So anyways, I think finding people on your team and building up a beautiful team that has some of these skills and expertise in the same is part of like a great co-design, is thinking about the right partners and being expansive about that, not just in the community, but also professionally or in the academy, so that the team can hold folks.
The final question in the sort of trilogy of navigating co-design was the one about how you write a proposal for funding or otherwise when you don't know what the outcomes are going to be.
Thank you for bringing me back there, Clara. Okay, great. So this is like the hardest question. And it is also kind of the hardest question, I would say, as a grant reviewer. And so I sit on both sides of this. I sit on the side of like writing these grants, and I sit on the side of I chair review panels at our national funders. And here are some of my thoughts on this. I think when you are writing a grant, you are showing you're trying to make a case, and you are trying to show the reviewers that you know what you are doing and that you will be competent and capable, that you are competent and capable to do what you say you're going to do. So I think it can be very helpful to create a plan, a detailed plan that shows that if we collect this kind of data, I know how I'm going to analyze that data, some strategies for disseminating that data, and then provide the caveat that says, but this may change if the community wants it to change. But I think that one of the big flaws I see a lot in grants is people sort of put in, I don't know what's going to happen. It's all dependent on the community. And while I think like that's great politically, it doesn't give me a whole lot of confidence that the team is going to be able to do whatever it is that might come from the community. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act of saying, I'm not sure, but I have some hunches. And if we go down this path, we as a team have the collective expertise and the budget and the know-how to do that really well. And if perhaps we go down this path, like we can also do that really well, and maybe provide like a series of options where you were demonstrating that we have that expertise. And I think it's hard, but also I know, at least in Canada, our research funders are quite flexible. So once we get the grant, we can change a lot of things. So part of the art is, how do I write a really good, clear, compelling grant that demonstrates that we have the partnerships in place, we have the methodologies, we have the expertise, and leave in a little bit of enough room to say, but this could change, but we'll stay in this world. I don't know. How do you do this, Claire? This is such a good question.
It's a great question, isn't it? And I think I would give an answer more or less along the lines that you've just given. Although, as you were talking, I was wondering about the degree of flexibility from our funders and exactly where those lie. I have this amazing student who I mentioned yesterday, who's an artist. He's internationally known, and his practice is predicated as an artist. Prior to doing research, his practice was predicated on a process that he considers very ethical. The outcome of his process, the result of his PhD, is that he can now put some language around what is ethical about it. It's a Levinasian kind of ethics, but it is predicated on responsiveness to the people he's working with. So he's a socially engaged artist who's worked in all kinds of settings. What drives the artistic outcome is the quality of the engagement and responsiveness of the artist to the people that he's working with. So it's explicitly and deliberately open-ended because that's part of the core ethical commitment. It has to be open-ended because it has to be very finely responsive to his collaborators. And And we somehow managed to convince an ethics committee to approve his project on that basis. But it was done in part on his really easy to demonstrate, extremely extensive, amazing track record. And I told you one or two stories about his work. I could tell so many. I'll tell one now for the sake of this Zoom. Australia doesn't have much in the way of snow, but there are a few ski fields high up in the so-called snowy mountains. And as you can imagine, they run resorts. Most of their income comes from a couple of months of utilisation during winter. Climate change projections suggest that within the next 10 years, their snow coverage could shrink to as little as a couple of weeks. So that is a huge and devastating alteration of both economy and landscape. And my colleague Vic McEwen from the CAD Factory was invited as an artist to come to work with this community facing this challenge. And one of the things he did was take photographs of some of the people who have lived in that community all their lives, and then he projected them onto clouds.
Oh, wow.
Transient, passing. And that's just, you know, I actually only have to tell a story like that to the ethics committee, and they got it, and they went, okay, that's enough evidence that he has, as you say, the competency in place and a clear capacity to describe this process and to show how it's been effectively utilised in a number of settings for us to accept that we have sufficient information to authorise a more open-ended process than would otherwise be appropriate, particularly when it's surrounded by protocols that make that explicit to participants and so forth.
And I think that's such a beautiful and thoughtful example. And I could imagine in writing that up as a protocol that you could provide a few of those kinds of examples. You know, I have done this, and that in the past, and that will provide a frame for how I might move forward in this context. But it might not be clouds. Next time I might be working with grass or seeds, or, you know, but textually providing that detail. Like, I don't think we ever walk into a community and it's a totally open box. You know, we know enough about what is happening and the kinds of skills we bring and the kinds of approaches we'll take, that if we can provide those kinds of detail and nuances, and certainly our track record, or at least projects we've been inspired by. If you're a newer investigator who maybe is a PhD student who doesn't have like a 10-year track record, you could say, I'm very inspired by Dr. Hooker's work or Dr. Flicker's work and in these particular ways. And that's how I'm going to kind of move that forward. So good luck grant writing to whoever asked that question. It is, you know, such a challenging job, but it does get easier. The more you play it, the game, you get better.
Actually, it's always helpful to have that kind of hopefulness, isn't it? I think that was the kind of trio of questions. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for all your time and your generosity and your willingness to be part of the conversation here in Australia. And we hope to have you back sometime.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you, Claire.